final panel discussion on the theme of reimagining multilateralism, views from India. We have Professor Rajen Harshe chairing the session, and we have a very distinguished set of panelists with us. We have Dr. Arvind Gupta, Director, Vivekananda International Foundation. He would be speaking on the theme of ideas for reform multilateralism. We have Dr. Sanjaya, Distinguished Fellow MP IDSA, and also the Chairman of Programs Committee ICWA. He would be speaking on reimagining multilateralism in a rebalancing global economy. We have Professor Ummu Salma Bava. She's professor at Center for European Studies, Jawaharlal University. She would be speaking at Reimagining Multilateralism, Partnership in Leadership. Then we have Professor W.P.S. Sidhu. He's a clinical associate professor at Center for Global Affairs, New York University. He would be speaking on the theme, Can India Reimagine Multilateralism? Over to you, Professor Harshe.
Good evening, everybody. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Raghavan and ICWA for inviting me to chair this interesting session. I think the theme is put in very imaginative terms itself, and we have also all interesting and well-known speakers. Just to start the debate, I will make some initial points and hand over to Dr. Arvind Gupta. I think the moment we think of reimagining something, somewhere our imagination is now failing and we have to rethink of things. And perhaps how do we reimagine it in terms of ideas? Then what kind of new ideas we are getting about the world from its politics and economy? Is it multipolar world? Is it multi-power world? How are we looking at it? For instance, United States, China, these are obvious powers. But Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, they are also important players in international politics today. If you are reimagining, then how do ASEAN or Shanghai Cooperation Organization or SADC, they kind of work out their multilateralism? There are many ways we can think of it, and where will India place itself in all these organizations, ASEAN or SCO? Or even SAARC? That is one question that was bothering me. Second thing was when I saw Sanjaya's title, Rebalancing, I think somewhere he's in the mold where you perceive of something like complex interdependence as integral part of world politics, world organizations and multilateralism. And this complex interdependence always allows somewhere hegemonic powers, because there is asymmetry of power relationship between countries. And a country like United States or China, suppose they are there of any group, part of any group, how would they behave? How the weaker countries which are there, they will also conduct themselves, and how it can be worked out. And allied to this is Professor Bava's presentation. She's talking about partnership and leadership both. So I think she's trying to synthesize something so that we get a different view. I'm also equally keen on listening to Professor Sidhu. I have read his Adelphi paper and I also met him once on one occasion. So it is, good four friends coming and talking, and I have been already warned by the organizers that we have to finish by 6 o'clock so that next session begins. So I will leave less time for myself, but little more for the speakers so that we all gain something out of this debate. 15 minutes each will be kind of time allotted to all of you. After that, we'll have question and answer session for 10 minutes. And if at all I have chairman's remark, I will make them at the end. So now, without wasting much time, let me request Dr. Arvind Gupta to give his presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Harshe, for those remarks. And I think you have set the scene very well for this session. I think it's a wonderful theme, reimagining multilateralism. And I suppose this is one place where we can do a little bit of kite flying, speculation, floating the balloons, or whatever you call it, just to think a little bit outside the box and move away from what we normally have been, what is the normal agenda of multilateralism. So I have chosen this theme of ethos and philosophy of Vasudev Kutumbakam. And the reason is because the Prime Minister has been mentioning this quite often in his speeches. And if I remember correctly, I think Professor Sidhu had also written an article some years ago. Is that right, WPS? I think you had written an article also, which I seem to have remember having read. So Vasudev Kutumbakam is something that now is gaining currency, not only in the speeches of our leaders, and also one is beginning to learn that this particular ethos is not new, but it's a very old theme, and it's actually a civilizational theme for Indians at least. We have done a couple of seminars, couple of conferences at the VIF, and we have also published the proceedings, etc. So some of what I'm saying, I'm just going to flag a couple of issues that or ideas that originated from those seminars. Now, Vasudev Kutumbakam seems to overcome the us versus them mentality, which is at the root of all conflict and violence. And the leading IR theory, namely realism, which of course dominates the world in so many ways, is essentially, or the Western theories just generally, I would say, are really based on the concept of the other. So in that sense, I think world is a family, that is what Vasudev Kutumbakam means, is a different idea from what we are used to, which is also reflected in the acute power politics without any morals that we see being played out. So I think this kind of a session and further discussions are needed to understand what does the concept mean, what is its philosophical basis, is it relevant to contemporary strategic reality, is it a practical concept, is it relevant to multilateralism? So we need to debate these questions, and when we think of reforming multilateralism, which is another of our Prime Minister's ideas that reformed multilateralism. So I think we should try and see whether this Vasudev Kutumbakam has any relevance for the reformed multilateralism. Now, the theme Vasudev Kutumbakam occurs in a verse of Mahopanishad, and also it's there in Hetopadesha, and in some form or the other, it is there in many places. Basically, in Sanskrit, there's a small verse in Mahopanishad, Adhyay 4 and Shlok 71, which reads, Ayam nijha paro veti ganana laghu chetasam, udar charitanam tu Vasudev Kutumbakam, which means, in Hindi it would mean, ये अपना बंधु है और वो अपना बंधु नहीं है. He is my friend, he is not my friend. इस तरह की गणना छोटे चित्त वाले लोग करते हैं, और उदार हृदय वाले लोगों के लिए तो संपूर्ण धरती ही परिवार है. Which means only people with petty outlook differentiate, saying this is my friend and this is not my friend. But for those with a magnanimous mind, the entire world is a family. So this is how it comes. And of course, in Hitopadesha, there are, the story is that is one of the smart jackal who is using this to confuse the deer, and because he wants to eat him. So he's using this lofty words, but actually, basically, the idea is being misused there. So there is a possibility of a misuse of the Vasudev Kutumbakam idea also. In the Vedic saying, there is earlier than that, Vedic saying also has Yatra Vishwam Bhavati Ekanidam. That world is a nest. So these kind of ideas are there in so many of our ancient scriptures. But it is not just a scriptural saying or a verse. I think the entire Indian thinking and philosophy has been suffused with this psyche. We are that world is a family, and this is reflected in our behavior and in so many other things that we say and do. And if you recall, I think the Chicago speech of Swami Vivekananda, where he talked about Hinduism and Indian civilization, and he exposed this to the world. And he essentially made 2 points. One is that the Hinduism as a religion, which is very old, there is a Sanatan Dharma in it, and it's a universal religion. It is relevant, and also that all religions are equal and all religions have good ideas, and there was an inclusiveness. So that kind of a powerful idea, which he gave in 1893, that has again, I think, been very much at the base of many of thinking of our leaders and thinkers and so on. So the context of the verse needs to be understood properly. I think the Indian philosophical thought underscores the concept of unity or oneness in the creation. So the Srishti is diverse, but there is interconnectedness and harmony in it. The idea of interconnectedness is now being accepted, and the concept of global commons underlines the interconnected nature of man and man with nature, and also the harmony between different races and different the diverse nature that diverse history that we have, the creation that we have. How is it all related? So interconnectedness is extremely important, and this idea is also reflected in the Vedantic philosophy, which is a very powerful philosophy, and it is becoming quite popular now in the discourse on how the world should be, and what are the ideas that we can take from some of these very powerful philosophies. We are all talking today about global cooperation to resolve global problems. So I think being an idea that unites rather than divide, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is a powerful idea which can help provide the basis for ongoing discussions about global cooperation, etc. And that therein lies its significance for the contemporary discourse on global cooperation. The oneness idea which underlies Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam does not impose uniformity. The imposition of uniformity, that you conform to my ideology or my thought or my style or else this will happen, I think that kind of a thinking brings strife and clashes and bloodshed. And that's why I think idea like Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam can be a good counterweight to those kind of thinking, that kind of a thinking. Now, as I said, the Vedantic philosophy, which contains the essence of the Vedas and the Upanishads, highlights the idea of oneness in creation. Now, according to Swami Sarvapriyananda, Vedanta is a philosophical foundation of Hinduism. But while Hinduism includes aspects of Indian culture, Vedanta is universal in its application and is equally relevant to all countries, all cultures, and all religious backgrounds. It affirms the oneness of existence, the divinity of the soul, and the harmony of all religions. So I think there is a lot in the Indian philosophy which can be relevant in today's world. But I think we should be careful about the practical aspects also. This is not an idea which is a standard liberal idea that we are all equal, all one, etc. I don't think it is that. In the practical sphere of politics, we have to approach Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam with certain nuance and care. The philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam indicates a tolerance, indicates a sense of tolerance. However, the tolerance of intolerance can lead to destruction of the tolerance itself. So we have to be aware of this paradox, and for Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam to be useful and workable, it must be accepted by all and it should be based on reciprocity. So one-sided implementation of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam will not work. And nor is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam a pacifist idea, because one can very easily degenerate into pacifism. That would be disastrous. Tolerance does not mean inaction. Lord Krishna in the Gita tells Arjuna to fight when it is his duty to protect the dharma. And but the war, which cannot really be banished, the war comes after every effort to avoid it has failed. So today I think Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam philosophy is needed because the world is torn in conflict. The spirit of mutual tolerance and cooperation needs to be inculcated, spread, taught, discussed. And Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam means that not only in the Indian context, it doesn't mean that India talks only of its own interest, but it also talks about the interest of the world. Then only it will become an acceptable idea. Now, I came across this, that the UN also has been talking in similar terms. The first decade of 21st century, I discovered, was declared by the UN as decade of culture of peace and disarmament. And now the UN regularly adopts a resolution on the culture of peace. And the Indian intervention very recently on this resolution on culture of peace quoted this idea and also talked about Swami Vivekananda and his speech, etc. And there was this gentleman, Anwarul Chaudhary, who is a Bangladeshi diplomat, senior diplomat, I think, who was very active at one point of time. And I quote him on this culture of peace. Simply put, the culture of peace as a concept means that every one of us needs to consciously make peace and non-violence as a part of our daily existence. We should not isolate peace as something separate or distant. We should know how to relate to one another without being aggressive, without being violent, without being disrespectful, without neglect, without prejudice. And the MEA's 2019-20 report has some paras on the visit of one gentleman, Anil Suklal, who is South Africa's Sherpa for BRICS. And he said somewhere, and this quote is from that MEA's report, he also pitched for creation of a new world order based on the principles followed by Gandhi and Mandela, as well as Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The world is one family, and Ubuntu. I am because we are. That is the meaning of Ubuntu. Or the belief in a universal bond of sharing that links the entire humanity. So the point I'm trying to make is that there seems to be now some acceptance that in the world which is now so much driven by power politics, with no morality whatsoever, rule of law, which is, we talk about rule of law, but most of these rules, regulation, norms, etc. are Western creation. I think there's need to be some kind of a change. And I just want to end by just quoting a little work that has been done at the VIF for the last 4 or 5 years. This is a Hindu-Buddhist dialogue called Samvad, which has been going on since 2015 among scholars, religious people, diplomats, politicians, and all kind of people have participated in it. 5-6 meetings have been held. And Prime Minister Modi and the former Prime Minister Abe of Japan had initiated this dialogue. The first dialogue was held in New Delhi and also in Gaya in 2015. And in fact, the next version of this is likely to be held shortly, within a few days, in fact. And Prime Minister Suga of Japan is expected to participate in this. And a lot of these people have attended, and philosophers, religious leaders, and scholars, and so on, politicians, etc. And if you look at all that they have produced, it's very clear that there is a very powerful urge that we must really move in new directions and prioritize peace over strife and struggle, and make peace a habit, as I quoted in the earlier part of my from the culture of peace thing. Now, this Samvad dialogue has yielded many principles which are quite common sense but known, but I think these are needed, that we should talk about these things in seminars like this. And a few points that I picked up from all that has been said by Buddhist leaders, Hindu leaders, professors, academics, diplomats, and so on. For instance, a few things that which would make a world better place, a few of those things are like inculcate the value of democracy, conflict avoidance, environmental consciousness, universal responsibility, and ethical behavior. Genuine open-minded dialogue held in a spirit of tolerance, mutual respect, and peaceful accommodation. And that is the best way to avoid conflict. We need to inculcate the habit of sustainable development, environmental consciousness. That's a very important part, environmental consciousness. Maintaining peace should be the priority. Hindu and Buddhist prayers invoke peace for everyone, everywhere. And for instance, Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina, Sarve Santu Niramaya. The coronavirus pandemic, which has now brought health to the center stage. This kind of things have been there in our thinking for a very, very long time. But in this game of power politics, which of course is there and cannot be neglected or overlooked, but these ideas should also find a place somewhere. Then the very fact we talk about it, but we never really, bring it into our discussions at these fora, that material wealth alone cannot bring peace. Every one of us understands it. I think we have grown in that kind of a thinking, but we somehow don't apply this to the world, where the power politics and geopolitics is so important. The Buddhisms talk about compassion, karuna, courtesy, generosity. Now, these are the ideas which, of course, are very important in our personal thing. But today I see that in our Mr. Jaishankar's speeches and some other speeches, a generous India, the idea of a generous India is also coming up, in the sense that during the COVID time, India came to the forefront and supplied medicine, etc., to 150 countries. A lot of this was free of cost, etc. So somewhere I read that the key to real and lasting peace lies in mental disarmament, disarming the mind from all kinds of poisonous defilements such as greed, hatred, jealousy, ego, etc. Now I know that these ideas seem very utopian, and in a normal international discourse, these would all be rejected out of hand. But I think if you have to think of a new world order, and if you're looking for new organizing principles, because the discussions so far are, okay, globalization has got astray, maybe you should bring it back, change here, change the World Bank and change the governance structure of the IMF, and things will be all right. I don't think things will be all right.
1 minute more.
How many minutes?
1 minute more now.
Okay. So I just want to end with one observation, that in 2019, France and Germany, they set up an initiative called an Alliance for Multilateralism. And this has been joined by several countries, India included. But if you look at what they are saying, actually they're saying the same thing again and again. Some of the ideas which have been tried and not really succeeded, they are being repeated. Okay, rule-based order, rule of law, that's what they say. We require it, but we really don't come to that discussion as to why rule of law and rule-based order is failing, and what are the main reasons. And if you go into those details, then perhaps you will also come to the conclusion that perhaps to make a humane, more caring, more tolerant world, you do require ideas like Vasudev Kutumbakam. You do need to imbibe more of ethics, a little bit more of morality, maybe with the touch of spirituality in international politics and economic discourse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gupta. Actually, you have been extremely persuasive in your argument, and I quite see the point that realism and neorealism, which are dominant theories in international relations today, whatever is dominant may not be universal. And you made that point very clearly. Second thing I thought was, it's a very important point that Udara Charitanam Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And somewhere that respect has to come. You are using the word tolerance, but maybe we also respect other views, other faiths. And that is very important part of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, because otherwise Sarve Bhavati Sukhana Santu wouldn't have come as a prayer. It's a very new way of looking. I'm very grateful to you. I will hand over now to Sanjay's presentation. Sanjay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was given to imagine we have 15 minutes each. So please don't be as liberal with me as you were with Arvind. Remind me when it's 15 minutes so that I'll stop. Okay? Because I don't want to go on. There are two other speakers after me. Dr. Gupta have taken our conversation to a very stratospheric level of philosophy and imagination. So therefore, I think it may be useful for me to bring it down to the ground, not as disagreeing with whatever he has said. Incidentally, I should mention that in every speech of Dr. Manmohan Singh at the UN between 2004 and 2009, there is a reference to Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam as an ideal, as an Indian ideal. So it is an idea that our prime ministers have articulated at the UN, and it's a good idea for prime ministers to articulate. But now, since we are talking about multilateralism and as it exists and how we would like to see it changed, let me talk about some of the issues that I feel we need to understand going forward. Now, I'm not an international relations scholar. I'm not a political scientist like our chairman and the other speakers. I'm an economist. And I look at power in very stark terms. So I'll disappoint both you and Mr. Gupta by becoming a realist, taking realism to the other extreme of saying money matters. Power derives from money. And hard power is what shapes international politics. So let me begin by saying that the multilateral system, as we see it over the post-war period, and that's what we've been talking about since the morning, is the result of a war that left victors and that left vanquished. Hard power used on the ground, destroying regimes and empowering regimes. The empowered created a multilateral system. Whether it's the United Nations, whether it's within the United Nations, the UN Security Council, whether it's the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, or indeed the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, every one of the multilateral institutions whose reform we are discussing today is a product of a certain confluence of hard power that existed at the end of the Second World War. I don't think a student of international relations, international politics, or international affairs should ever forget this hard reality. Because to imagine that you can actually reform a system based on hard power with very interesting ideas and ideologies and formulations, I don't think that will go very far. The second point I'd like to make is that the multilateral system, as it has evolved, represents a changing balance of power as it has evolved over the last 70 years. And therefore, the challenge for those of us who seek to reform it is to understand the nature of the change in the balance of power. Because if in its origins the system is based on power, and if in its functioning it represents changing balance of power, then its evolution can only be based on a proper understanding of the nature of power and its articulation across the world. These are my two propositions. We had a fascinating session earlier today. I don't know if some of you joined that, on the evolution of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. If you read some of the analysis of the actual negotiations that went into the creation of these institutions, you can see how economists of that time, men like John Maynard Keynes, the economist of the 20th century, had to come to terms with the assertion of hard power by the United States. All of us call IMF and World Bank as the creations of Keynes, that the Bretton Woods institutions were the creation of Keynes. Did not create them. Keynes had a certain conception which was put aside. It's the United States Treasury that created this system. And almost at every point, and there's a very good analysis of all this available now, several books, at every point, the British view of what should be was prevented by an emerging, rising United States. In fact, if you look at the history of the creation of the multilateral financial system and multilateral economic system, it's very interesting to see how the contest between a declining Britain and a rising United States is reflected in that period of time. What we are now seeing in the last decade is a very similar contest between a rising China and a declining West. And therefore, I think it's useful. The historical session that we had earlier today was useful for those of you who are interested in history to understand how power gets articulated in the creation of a multilateral system and in its change. You look at the global trading system, what we call the multilateral trading system. The GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, was a system articulated again by the United States, implemented by the United States with the consent of several countries. India was also a founding member of GATT. So it's not as if it was unilaterally imposed by the United States. It was a system created by the most powerful country of that period, 1950s, with the consent of a large number of countries. But if you see its evolution, at every point when GATT did not serve the interests of the United States, the US challenged GATT. Many of us forget now Super 301, Special 301, voluntary export restraints. What was this? They were imposed on Japan, an ally of the United States, to prevent Japanese exports to the United States. And Japan, the terminology used was VERs, voluntary export restraint. Japan was made to reduce its export. So the so-called free trade system again manifested power equations and changing power equations. That's the third point I'll make. My fourth point is that the change that we have seen between the creation of these multilateral institutions in the 1940s and 50s and today is that the two vanquished powers of the Second World War, namely Japan and Germany, emerged as what I have called in my writings as geo-economic powers. Their power was manifest in their economic power. Germany became the most powerful economy in Europe. Having been defeated by France and Britain, Germany reasserted its power within Europe with its economic strength. And the European Union essentially is an organization dominated by Germany with the acquiescence of France. Similarly, in the East, till the rise of China, it was a system that was dominated by Japan. So both Japan and Germany represent a form of empowerment of nations which is not based on nuclear power. Neither of them is a nuclear power. Not based on acquisition of large armies. Neither of them has large armies. In fact, Japan does not even have a formal army. But based on their economic power. And therefore, my fourth proposition is that the transition or the nature of power between the creation of these multilateral institutions, which were the products of the assertion of hard power, Second World War, and what we confront today is the intermediation of economic power. The lesson we learned from the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of China, is again precisely this, that the Soviet Union, which was a hard power, a victor of the Second World War, dissolved itself because of its economic incapacity to sustain its power. While China has emerged as today the world's number one trading power, number two power in terms of both PPP and GDP and dollar defined GDP, and in all senses of the term is now the second superpower, right? This transition of power is again in economic terms. China's military power is nowhere compared to that of the United States. In fact, the US has a military presence which is larger than that of China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, Brazil, all combined together. So it's not in military terms that China has asserted its power, in economic terms. So when we talk about reforming multilateralism, whether it's the financial institutions, the economic institutions, or indeed the United Nations system, I think as India, as an Indian, I have to accept the fact that money is the foundation of power in the modern world. That unless you have a strong economy, all your idealistic talk about the world being one family, etc., people will listen to you, clap at the end of the speech, and then ask you what is your GDP. So the problem of reform of the multilateral system today, as I see it, is essentially, for the rest of the world, if you look at it from a global perspective, is one of accommodating China. That's the real issue. There are two ways in which the United States can accommodate China. I mean, there are two ways in which it can deal with China's rise. One is to challenge China's rise, and two is to accommodate China's rise, right? The only two ways in which the US can respond. Either it challenges China's rise or it accommodates China's rise. Either way is a problem for us. And I think that's something we as, we in India should understand, that US accommodation of China or US challenging of China both present problems for us. And therefore we are in a very, very difficult situation in terms of international governance. What is the way out for India? And this brings me to my last point, which is, as I have argued in a couple of pieces I've recently written, that I take this idea, intellectual the tribute I should pay to Samuel Huntington, who wrote an essay, I think sometime in the late 90s, in which he coined a phrase that what we see is not a unipolar world. He was challenging the then prevalent view that after the Cold War we had a unipolar world. He said what we see in the world today is a uni-multipolar world, which is that United States is on top, but it has to deal with a large number of other powers, and the US is not in a position to unilaterally assert itself. As a reformulation of that, I argue that we today are in a bi-multipolar world. In other words, it's not bipolar, but it's not multipolar. It is a bi-multipolar world in which China and the United States are at the top, and then there are a lot of middle powers. And as I said, just to repeat myself, whether the US accommodates China or challenges China, it poses a problem for us. I think this is not adequately appreciated in India, that both constitute a challenge for Indian diplomacy and India's relations with the rest of the world. So what does India do? And my argument has been that we need to deal with middle powers. And I was delighted to see our foreign minister in one of his recent interventions talk about this. The need for India to in fact strengthen its relations with middle powers. And that brings me to the last point, which is that any reform, whether it's of the United Nations system, whether it is of the international financial system, whether it is in climate change negotiations, whether it is about a nuclear-free world, whatever multilateral negotiations or multilateral regime we are talking about, India's interests lie in dealing with a range of middle powers. They do not necessarily lie. They may on some issues lie with the US. They may on other issues lie with China. There are many issues on which we actually have a closer position to China than the US. And there are many issues on which we have a much closer position to the US than China. But working with middle powers, by which I mean Russia, Germany, France, Japan, Australia, I think these are the countries that Jaishankar mentioned in his speech, but one could add a couple of others, Saudi Arabia, for example, or even Iran. Middle powers which are not happy with either a world dominated by the United States or the world dominated by China. and which are equally worried about either accommodation of China by the US or challenging of China by the US. We have seen that in the last few months how it has been playing out. And I think we are at the right time looking at a transition in the United States to see how the US will redefine its equations with its own allies, Germany, Japan, Britain, etc. But I think what are the opportunities that India has in dealing with middle powers in whatever issues, whether it's the reform of the IMF, reform of the WTO, the trading system, climate change, etc. I think that's the agenda we should be looking for going forward. Those are the countries with which we need much more dialogue, much deeper conversations, and to see the only problem, and I'll stop with this, is that both France and Britain are members of the UN Security Council and are unlikely to accept any change which weakens their position within the UNSC. Therefore, I think echoing some of the thoughts expressed earlier today in this discussion, I guess we have to live with some of that reality of the past, even though the power equations have changed in real terms. But any reform will have to be based on a realistic assessment that the transition will not 100% satisfy us, but what is it that can satisfy us to the extent that we are not harmed by the structure of bi-multipolarity that we now face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. You are as scintillating as ever. Few things that I could draw from you. I think declining Britain and rising USA, a rise of vanquished powers like Germany and Japan. Actually, they emerged as trading and banking rivals of the United States. I would only like to add one footnote that United States has, still four very major ingredients of power that makes it sole military superpower. And those are security-related complexes. United States is still at the top. Technology, trade, and knowledge-producing apparatuses, universities and all learning institutions. So United States has a place, but you rightly pointed out about China, which is challenging, and how to, whether United States manages China, handles it, or it enjoys restrained rivalry and limited cooperation, we'll have to work it out. And India either way is losing. I quite see the point about middle-ranging powers, and India is somewhere taking steps in those directions via BRICS and other organizations. But it was, as usual, very thought-provoking. First, Arvind gave us, he mesmerized us with ideas, and Sanjay has brought us to the earth. And we can now think more practically about it, leadership or partnership. So let me hand over to now Professor Bava. Ummu.
Thank you, Chair. Let me begin by first thanking Ambassador Raghavan, DG ICWA, for the invitation to participate in this webinar, which I think is extremely timely. And I would also like to thank Deepening and the staff at ICWA for all the support. Let me say that, I just recently completed a 3-month extensive engagement with the EU on the crisis of multilateralism, which fed into the EU position at the United Nations. So my task, as Rajen, as you say, is, both Dr. Gupta and Dr. Baru gave me 2 bookends to anchor my presentation. So between the world of ideas and the hard world power of mix, I think one is trying to see how do you create a system, because both are essential. You cannot have one without the other. And I think as India joins the UNSC for a 2-year term, it's a good opportunity to assess how it can contribute to provide a new impulse that can produce a more inclusive and sustainable multilateralism. So I want to use this occasion also to propose to ICWA to launch a special 2-year series on India at the UN, which will be coterminous with this 2-year period, and focus and engage with issues through webinars, special lectures, and maybe even a project to create sustained interest and knowledge base. Because I think being a recorder of history is a crucial task which institutions like ICWA can play. So what I intend to do in the short time is, present on 3 points here. First is the current state of play regarding multilateralism, which some of the speakers have alluded to during the day, the challenges as I see it, and where do I see India's role, which I call that, it needs to partner in order to undertake leadership. I think 75 years of the UN system very clearly see the crossroads of multilateralism is facing today, and what is required and how does it secure global public goods in a more inclusive fashion. I think the crisis of multilateralism, of cooperation among states with respect to these goods, has become fragmented because of the growing matrix of issues, which has reduced two things. One is the legitimacy and the output capacity of the existing institutions, and it questions, as Sanjay was talking about, the power of a few to decide for all. More recently, I think what COVID has done has not only been the biggest disruptor in contemporary times, where it has endangered public health in communities, it has also contracted economies. So that means the power which Sanjay was talking about has also gone down. But I think what we've seen is the unprecedented scale at which globalization-induced interdependence has produced a very painful consequence of dependence on a single supply chain. And a fourth point over here, I think, which we should take stock, is never before in human history has a single stroke like a pandemic meant the loss of decades of development in a matter of few months, pushing back people globally into poverty, inequality, and it also imperils the whole SDGs. So that is what we are looking at. And that brings me to the second point and the second set of arguments I want to make about the challenges that multilateralism faces today. If that is the preferred way of doing business, then what is it that we're looking at? And obviously the devil lies in the details. And the first thing that we are confronted is that the very definition of global public good has expanded from the limited ideas of 1945. So that also tells us about the gap between institutions and ideas. And for the first time, I think, even though WHO has existed from 45, it has been there, but public health for the first time is being viewed from the prism of a global public good. That really changes the rules of engagement, because if you have an entire population around the globe who's going to be unwell, all your indices of power are going to be impacted. And I think we're seeing that very clearly what happens. A second thing which we need to bring into mind is also that the tech-driven world has created corporations who have already taken a lead through data acquisition. And this new tech-based interdependence is becoming highly securitized. So even as we talk, companies can enter the domestic realm, they can influence political outcomes and foreign policy. So while we're still talking about, guarding the old border, it is being challenged by technology that can undermine your border without your knowledge. And more importantly, consent is not required to undermine your power. I think that's a very important point to keep in mind as we argue. A third thing is, which has already been alluded to, is the rising geopolitics and the reconfiguration of power which is taking place. Sanjay just spoke about the multipolarity he's talking about. And so as a consequence of that, what we are really witnessing is contested multilateralism. And what is that producing? I think that is producing extreme strategic ambiguity. Remember, any ambiguity for states means that we cannot get outcomes, or we will get less than perfect outcomes. So as a consequence, we are witnessing a contestation between existing international institutions on the one hand and a rising local orders or regional orders, in which both inclusivity and leadership are going to be very critical factors. And so I flag here China, BRI, RCEP as examples of what parallel orders can be created, right? As a consequence of this, we also see that there is a preference to move away from the UN as the arching framework and going for a club governance. That means select partnerships. So what it does is it jeopardizes collective action, which could happen under the rubric of the UN. And what the pandemic has done is it has only pushed a trend towards two very important things: a trend towards deglobalization we are also witnessing, and a fragmentation with respect to collective action. I think one only needs to mention the vaccine nationalism we are seeing, which also signals the danger of a drift into a very semi-Hobbesian space of privileging exclusion. I think we are in real danger of that. And I'm really presenting my arguments in very short points, so I think trying to be brief so that we can engage more. I could come back to some of this later. Let me move then. Where do I see if this is the situation where we are coming from, the lay of the landscape in front of us, where power is actually being diminished even as we seek and search to enhance our power? I believe that India today stands at a historical moment where it can enhance its engagement by seeking leadership through partnership. I think the baton-changing way of power, where war was definitive, is over. We have, in some ways, outlawed war in that sense, and we will have exceptions to some of it happening, but that is over. So I think in this globalized, interdependent, even with fragmentation, how do we go forward? I think it's very clear that the need to reform multilateralism also requires to build new convergence in the way forward to shape collective action as a platform of global governance is also growing exponentially. I think I alluded to the new issues: health, cyber, technology, AI, new economies, the rise of non-state actors. In each arena is transforming how the rules of engagement are going to. Okay. Can you hear me? I think the connection is back.
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Very sorry about that. Okay. So I said there's a time to reset, reimagine, and reinvest. And I think a value-based, and I think that's where, the point by Dr. Gupta is important to take on board. Where do we draw on what do we have? A value-based is important, but also we need to develop rules of global engagement, which is in India's interest, not only to reduce transaction cost, but remember it also produces system stability. And that's what you're looking at. And India should seek to build a pragmatic coalition of countries to work with in few areas to establish leadership that I think signals two things: political will and political intentionality. I believe that the moment of hedging our bets and hesitation is over. You cannot do that indefinitely. A window of opportunity is opened. And we have to ask, how can we put together an ambitious vision of what we have, of what we want to do, and how do we convince others to join in? That's important. I believe that the ability to lead, as Dr. Baru also pointed out about power, is the ability to lead is a function of capability, capacity, and intentionality. So political will and political opportunity have to be brought into focus, and I think the current conditions favor such a strategic approach where we step out and would like to don this mantle of leadership, but together in partnership. I think the G4 is a good example of leadership when we're looking at reform of the UN. You can't do it singularly and alone. So what kind of cooperation we want to see, what new kind of architecture, and what kind of issue-based coalition? And more importantly, how do we define our role? I think because when you look at leaders, and when we look at what happened in America recently, I think it's important that leadership is also about perception management. So in what way is India's leadership going to be different is extremely crucial in the way we articulate our ideas. So reimagining multilateralism needs a multi-pronged approach in which political, economic, ideational, and legal aspects have to go in tandem, hand to hand. And I'd like to conclude in the last few minutes by taking a very specific example of what I have been presenting. And that is to take the Indo-Pacific region as a good example where a multi-pronged approach can be seen. It's a new domain area for India's foreign policy, and with the Sagar policy of inclusive growth, the 7-pillar vertical approach, I think it showcases India is seeking leadership in partnership in this region. The Indian Ocean Dialogue, the IRA, the Conference on Maritime Security, India, ASEAN, the Quad, you could name it, all signal the shift to engage and to be more proactive rather than be reactive, as we have seen. I think these actions also clearly show that India is building leadership through partnership, which has enhanced its credibility as a leader, reaching out to small island nation states. The HADR initiatives all show that it has created tremendous amount of goodwill, which is extremely crucial when you talk of leadership. On the other hand, what it has also done strategically, it has brought down the cost of leadership. I think we cannot get one without the other, and we have to ask, how do we bear cost? The creation of, I think, within the Ministry of the Indian Ocean region and the Oceania division also signal a very strong, policy shift in New Delhi and an adaptation to changing geopolitical interest. I think that rapid transformation in the last 4 years, I think, augurs well about, the ability to be agile and swift. I think the time to be slow is over. And I think it also shows about the reorganization of the geo-economic and political engagement with the intention to build what I see as operational capacity. Because at the end of the day, what has been asked often is, do we have that capacity to lead? I think the last months have also clearly shown, the government's determination to enhance its political, diplomatic, and security profile in the Indo-Pacific region as India expands its capability and operations. It is through partnership that it seeks augmentation, and more importantly, it is about not against anybody else. As Dr. Gupta was pointing out, the idea is be as inclusive. Sagar is about everybody's development in the region, and I think that is why it ties into the ideational very well. So, as I conclude, let me say 4 points. First, that partnerships are the key to address diverse challenges and build communities of like-minded groups who also endorse similar political values, because this enables to build trust and work towards interest convergence and partnership. I think the legitimacy and the output problem of what we are talking about has to squarely be addressed over here. You can't do the same thing. Second, I think through the IPR, maritime multilateralism and mainstreaming it should be one policy area for India to work with strategic partners. I think that will produce deliverable results. Third, given that the Indo-Pacific region, it has so many numerous sub-theaters and actors, I would recommend that India look at a scaled-up regional engagement in operationalizing this kind of a maritime partnership. You can't do everything, but you need to prioritize, and in your basket of risks, look at what will produce different kind of visible results. And that brings me to a point where India should not shy away from. I mean, if you want to take leadership, if you want to reimagine it, branding your activity is extremely important. So I would really, argue for co-branding multilateral efforts and initiatives, and the IPR would be one area which would bring visibility and augment capacity building. And I think as India articulates its ideas and steps up to create new institutions and platforms of engagement, what's very important in all of this is not to lose sight of strategic clarity. I think the fundamental question India would need to ask is, as you have this bipolar, multipolarity, Sanjay, you spoke about, is then how is it we want to create a difference through our foreign policy? In what way would it be an ideationally value-based foreign policy and still inclusive, still having the legitimacy output, and still, keeping global governance at the center, because otherwise we will be back to the same kind of politics all over again. So will the 21st century be a different kind of century? Is it the time when, Asia will step up, and India in particular, with its long ideational history, a civilizational base, would it be different? So I think India has been an engaged multilateral actor in the past. I think the earlier sessions on, as a founding member of the UN peacekeeping and on the climate change, all of it shows an engaged actor. In this 21st century, I would say what we need is a far more strategic outlook is important, as India needs to build very strong negotiating skills as it articulates norms and standards and pushes for reforms of institutions. It would also have to enhance its political capacity and step forward with partners to lead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you tried to synthesize what Arvind and Sanjay tried to do in different directions. It's charming to think of leadership and partnership, and somewhere we are persuasive. Certain areas which perhaps need our attention is cyber security, and these days we think of data as new oil. War for technological hegemonism between America and Russia, several such issues are there. But some of the examples which you gave of Indo-Pacific, they were quite perceptive. Now, without wasting more time, I would request Professor Sidhu. You have the floor, Professor Sidhu. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Harshe. Wonderful to see you again. It's been much too long, but, and I'm particularly grateful to Director General Dr. Raghavan for actually facilitating this timely conference and the invitation. I'm really going to, my job has been made very easy by three amazing presentations that have preceded mine. And so I will just really build on that and try and bring in perhaps a perspective from New York, much closer to, in some ways, the UN-centered multilateralism. I want to begin, Professor Harshe, by sort of echoing what you said right in the beginning of what exactly do we mean by multilateralism. Which multilateralism are we talking about? Are we talking about the inclusive, all-encompassing Vasudev Kutumbaka multilateralism? Or is it really just code for India's permanent membership of the Security Council? And neither one is problematic. I think we just need to be candid about it and sort of see, how the whole element links up. Or should we even be using the word multilateralism? Is that perhaps a 20th century construct? And maybe we need to now think about, terms like multi-stakeholderism, which I'll talk about a little bit as well. What I intend to do is, again, in three short parts, first talk about the global trends that we're witnessing, which are impacting multilateralism in unprecedented ways in the 21st century. Second, really talk about the reality of what one US scholar has called messy multilateralism, and I'll expand on that a little bit. And then the third is try to address the question of, can India reimagine multilateralism? So there are three major trends that we're seeing, which are also being facilitated by six other factors. So the first trend we're seeing is, in fact, the growing intra-state conflicts. And these are not just related to civil wars, but secessionist movements, takeover of ungoverned spaces by extremist groups, as well as urban violence to terrorism, the whole gamut, which practically every country has to contend with. But even if you don't, there are the transnational dimensions of that. Second, it's very clear the post-Cold War honeymoon is certainly over. There is now a deepening tension, as we know, between the major international rivals, which is evident in the increased interstate conflicts and the proxy wars that we're seeing, including some between nuclear armed states. And the prospect of nuclear weapon use by accident, miscalculation, or even madness cannot be ruled out. And that's something, again, to keep in mind. The third sort of a broad mega trend that we're seeing is the slew of old and new transnational threats. The old ones haven't gone away, but the new ones now kind of superimpose that. These are both natural, but also human-made, which no single nation can manage on its own. These range from pandemics, and of course we're here in the era of COVID-19, but even Ebola earlier, natural disasters, wildfires, floods, locusts, climate change-induced catastrophes, global criminal networks, international extremist organizations, cyber and other forms of attack, and of course, proliferation networks. Now, these are problematic enough, but they're actually being in some ways driven even more dramatically by six other trends that we're starting to see, or we actually do see worldwide. One is the emergence of the uber-national populist governments who are putting their own nations first and challenging the very globalization that actually helped them, come to where they are at the moment. And you see this evidently in the walking out of international agreements or opting out of them in different ways. The second trend is really, and of course, Dr. Baru here is the expert in this, the fragile global economic backdrop, which is now being marked by unprecedented trade wars. The Great Recession of 2008 shook up global confidence in global capitalism, and it's required extraordinary intervention by states and international organizations. So in some ways, the Washington Consensus is in tatters, and there is no alternative to it as well. The next trend is also really the emergence of a disorderly multipolar world, by which I mean that while in some ways, if you use Thomas Friedman's "the world is flattish," the world is in fact moving towards political, economic, technological, and normative multipolarity. But when it comes to the ability to project power, there is still, as even Dr. Baru pointed out, only one country that you can see as a potential global enforcer, and that's the United States. So it may be very well for the middle countries to work together, but there's still, unless they have the ability to also enforce, there is going to be a problem. Similarly, and this is an interesting element that we often tend to overlook, we are now also starting to see multipolarity, by which I mean the role of actors beyond the officialdom, also within domestic, regional, and global rules. Take, for example, now this is on the really on the emergence of many stakeholders beyond the traditional state in the decision making at the national, regional, and global levels. And it's quite clear that they would also need to be heard and engaged if we are to think about the new multilateralism. The next point we need to keep in mind is the rapid pace of technological evolution and diffusion. The fact that we're actually all here on this platform would have been inconceivable even a decade ago. But the fact that it's become the new reality is something that we need to accept and acknowledge. And last but not the least, while propaganda has always been a decisive instrument in global affairs, and multilateralism is part of that, the advent of 24/7 global social media, coupled with factless news or fake news, whatever you want to call it, the armies of trolls, and the ability to influence millions across borders, whether in elections or in any other way, are also disruptive tendencies and threats that we need to recognize and acknowledge. So it's fair to say, bringing me to my second sort of set of issues, that there has been a crisis in multilateralism. This crisis predates that of COVID-19. And this was evident in the nation first policies, best exemplified by the US withdrawal from the Arms Trade Treaty, the Paris Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, the Human Rights Council, and the disengagement from the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this trend may have been dealt a blow with the electoral defeat of Donald Trump, but it still remains to be seen how far the Biden-Harris administration may move in the direction of multilateralism as well. Second, we're also now seeing, in terms of the great power conflict, a resurgent China, a retreating US, a revanchist Russia, locked in great power competition, which is now playing out in the UN over Syria, Venezuela, and ironically, even COVID-19. And third, and equally significant, the multilateral system today is clearly ill-prepared to deal with the new transnational crisis that we are seeing. Climate, cyber, energy, ocean, outer space, and even trade, as we've seen. In addition to that, rising inequalities, criminal, terrorist, and proliferation networks, and virulent extremism. All of these are already problematic for the UN-centered multilateral system, and COVID-19 has really just accelerated that crisis. But before I turn to messy multilateralism, let me also present a ray of hope. We've also actually seen significant developments, particularly in the normative area, from even emerging hegemonic states in three areas of the UN's endeavor. First, in the peace and security arena, we've seen the UN has successfully negotiated the UN Security Council Resolution 1540 in 2004, the Arms Trade Treaty in 2013, and literally this year, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And I'll come back to why these are important. Similarly, the negotiations of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 and the Paris Climate Change Agreement, with all its limitations, is really remarkable as well. Last but not the least, an area that we haven't talked about very much, the human rights arena, and today actually being the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's important to keep in mind that there have also been significant developments there, both in terms of the Human Rights Council, but also special procedures and independent investigations, which on the one hand have explored the role of non-regional actors in Yemen to also investigating the killing of Khashoggi. So I think, you really have a new spectrum coming up there. So what we're really faced with is messy multilateralism, by which I mean, which is characterized by 5 points. Number one, you're now also seeing a multipolarity of forums. And Professor Bava mentioned this very, very clearly. You have regional contenders to global areas. And even at the global level, you've got different forums. G20, for example, and I'll come to that in a minute. But you also have countries doing forum shopping. So if you don't get something in one forum, you move to another one, which you may see is slightly more benign to your interests, etc. Second, we're now seeing charter and treaty-based permanent institutions coexisting with ad hoc, flexible, and purpose-built groupings like the G20, right? And both are equally important. Third, instead of formally, legally binding obligations, there are also voluntary codes of conduct. And the Paris Agreement is the best example of this, the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Fourth, instead of a comprehensive approach to issues and challenges, what we're also seeing is a piecemeal approach, kind of almost like a bottom-up approach. And last, the interactions among these various actors are starting to be simultaneously trans-governmental, multi-level, and multi-stakeholder. And you're negotiating the same kind of issues in different forums precisely for the reasons that I've said. Another trend, which is really important for us to keep in mind, is the growing quantitative and qualitative role of non-hegemonic sovereign states, some of which Dr. Baru already identified, but I would include many, many others as well, and sovereignty-free non-state and sub-state actors, by which I mean individuals, and think about people like Greta Thunberg, or Setsuko Thurlow, the Hibakusha survivor from Hiroshima, who really pushed for the TPNW. But let's also not, forget India's own NGO actors who were able to push through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Hansa Mehta. So India does have a tradition of working with civil society and individuals and non-governmental organizations. Second, cities and states have also become crucial actors. For example, you see New York City taking on a very, very different role than what Washington, D.C. is doing. Third, the role of NGOs in the multi-stakeholder process and space and multilateralism should not have been ignored, but is certainly become even more important today. They are now an integral part of various negotiations as well. Fourth, the corporate sector, which we haven't talked about at all, has become another legitimate actor in multilateralism and in multi-stakeholder. Just to give you an indication of that, Microsoft has now opened a liaison office with the United Nations, because clearly they see that as an important element. Last but not the least, and here I'm going to make a plug on behalf of Professor Bava and myself, academia. Academia has now also been providing much more of the data which is required, and a really good example and illustration of this is the UN 75 report. On the 75th anniversary of the UN, instead of having a big celebration, they actually conducted a worldwide survey, which NYU facilitated the processing of that data. And it led to the UN report with inputs from over 1 million people worldwide. And these are individuals. They're not nationals in that sort of a sense. And for the first time, the UN has actually empowered the We the People's Pledge of its own preamble. And it's not surprising that this now finds echo in the General Assembly Declaration of 21st of September. And while the declaration calls for leaving no one behind, protecting the planet, and of course this would be music to India, install new life in the discussions on the reform of Security Council, right? But the challenge remains that unless we can really work with all of these other actors that I've just mentioned, we are not going to go forward. And let me then move to the last part of it by identifying and saying what you're now witnessing with all that I've shared is 21st century multilateralism. Welcome to it. So what's India going to do in this context? And I think there's just 4 or 5 things that I want to highlight there. One is it still going to try and hold on to the notion of strategic autonomy, and what might that look like in the 21st century? Second, also recognizing that there is going to be global repercussions of domestic policies as well, however much they may be in the domestic realm, and this is simply a dimension of globalization. Third, there is certainly a constraint of resources and personnel. For example, India is one of the only aspiring countries of the UN Security Council membership that does not have a UN association. The number of universities or think tanks working on multilateralism exclusively is practically non-existent. Where is this discussion going on? And it needs to happen. Third, we need to also have regular consultations at one level with the P5, the permanent 5, also with the G4, Brazil, Japan, and Germany, to actually have something like a common minimum program. The India, Brazil, South Africa combined. And last but not the least, and of course I would turn to Professor Harshe's expertise on this, is the role of Africa. Africa today has really become an indispensable nation for multilateralism and for India to play a bigger role in that as well. Last but not the least, I think, given that India is now entering the Security Council for a 2-year term, we really need to step up our role at the highest level. There has never been a prime ministerial level meeting at the UN by India. We've seen that by other countries. I think it's time for India to do that as well. And it needs to be very practical, and it needs to be very, very focused on that. These next 2 years are a tremendous opportunity for India to really reimagine multilateralism. But the question I leave you with, is India ready? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a great presentation. And I would say, I would live with the idea of disorderly multipolar world. It gives so much scope for imagination that something old is still living, new is also emerging. There is no stalemated power relationship. All problems go on existing. Mm-hmm. The second area I thought you kind of put across well, and we need to think about it, is post-truth politics. Because of post-truth politics and the way social media is behaving, I think democracy as a governance is affected everywhere, so are human rights. And is this the cause for authoritarian populism across the world also needs to be thought about. One interesting thing also that emerged from your presentation was how transnational and subnational actors like cities are coming to the center stage, and perhaps they're taking away the place of nation state in some form. That there is something like fluid reality where nation states are trying to survive, fighting something coming up from below and fighting something which is coming from above. And the last point that I thought I should make is that you gave some interesting silver linings, which kind of pleased me, like peace, security, then also arms trade of treaty of 2013. So there are silver linings also. It's complex, it's grey, it's not all that black and white. And that complexity came out from your presentation. Now we have 15 minutes left almost, but some questions are there in the chat, and I think the questions are primarily addressed to Dr. Sanjay Baru. So I think, Sanjay, can you read them? Hello?
Yeah, let me see.
Yeah, or 2 questions are there for you only in the chat. If you can answer them, it would be nice.
Okay, so one question is, despite balance of power dynamics, how can India leverage its Sagar policy of collaborative maritime development and Indo-Pacific approach to strengthen its case or philosophy for multilateralism? And the second question is, do you think the establishment of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank symbolizes rise of China and decline of US, how do you see role of Europe in the context of AIIB? Well, you see, first of all, on Sagar, I mean, these are all important initiatives. India has taken a series of important initiatives. But I come from the discipline of economics, and for me, the bottom line is important. And the bottom line is that we walked out of RCEP. And this is a question I have, posed to a lot of people in this country. What does Indo-Pacific mean if we are not part of RCEP? Now, I know the international relations scholars will have lots of answers to that question. But as an economist, I do believe that if you are not part of an economic arrangement in the region, how can you claim to be part of anything more than an economic arrangement? And so, ultimately, whether it's in the Indian Ocean, whether it is Sagar, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, or even SAARC for that matter, what is the biggest problem in SAARC is the very little economic engagement within SAARC. Each of the SAARC members, including India, has a larger economic engagement with China than with each other. So, these forums are all creations. There are several organizations of which India is a part, but I think the bottom line is really very important. That is where the reference to Asian Infrastructure Bank is important. I mean, the Chinese have acquired the economic cloud. They are now 5 times bigger than India, so there's no comparison. We are no longer in the same basket. They are a virtual superpower, if not in military terms, certainly in economic terms. And they have created the institutions, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative or the Asian Infrastructure. These are all parallels to the Bretton Woods system. And even the RCEP is in a sense a parallel to the multilateral trading system. So the Chinese are creating their own institutions for projection of their power. And our bottom line is really to look inwards and see how do we strengthen our own economy and our own competitiveness, global competitiveness, and our ability to trade with the world so that we remain engaged in these fora. That's it.
That's it. Now, what I thought was, I would give 1 minute each to every speaker before I my concluding remarks, because several points were made on Dr. Gupta. And in 1 or 2 minutes, everyone will get, so they can clarify their positions, because different things have come in this very interesting session. And so may I hand over again to Dr. Gupta to kind of have his final say.
Thank you very much. I think all that was said is all very true. The question remains, what should India do, and how does India deal with this complex world? And as I said, power is not going to go away. But let us see whether if India has certain strengths, if it has certain civilizational strengths, can we harness them to deal with this world? That is, I think, the main point. It is not that pacifism, as I said, is certainly disastrous, and that is not the way to go. But since there is, Dr. Sidhu mentioned a lot of things, a lot of new trends, which the existing multilateralism simply cannot handle. And Sanjay said that we should deal with the middle powers. Yes, we should deal with middle powers. But what is it that we should talk with them? Can we bring some new ideas? So today, I think when India, which is a civilization of 5,000 years old, whether it has certain ideas, it was called Vishwaguru at one point of time, which really meant that we were able to contribute with ideas. Now, if India is going to be a recipient of ideas all the time and only reactive, so if there's a rule-based order, somebody has made a rule-based order in 1944, 1945, and now we are reacting and saying how to make it better. But so we are, yes, we can try and adjust because we don't have that kind of power as yet. While we build our hard power, but I think our soft power is also equally important. it is a combination of hard and soft power, and the soft power coming from our civilizational experience. We have a tremendous case to tell the world how we have managed our diversity, living in harmony. I think that is something that people are looking forward to. Or the kind of ideas, today in environment or in climate change, which is basically respect for nature, how it is ingrained in Indian thinking. I think these are the ideas that we have to start working, and particularly when you deal with the non-state actors, which is something that was also mentioned, non-official. I think some of these ideas can be very useful. And when you talk about health, education, poverty, leave no one behind, etc., where better to look than in Indian civilization? So I think that is probably what the Vasudev Kutumbakam, which is really a
Right,
catchword
right.
for India's soft power. That is what I think we should build on.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Babu, would you like to say something? Would you like to say something?
No, I have nothing
I
more
will
to
give it
add.
back.
Thank you.
Directly. Dr. Bava.
Yeah, just one point. I think it's very clear from all the discussions that what you need is to be effective, to be able to make an outcome and a distinct difference. Is India would need to really do a capacity augmentation at the political level, at the economic level, socio-cultural, and very importantly at the ideational level, as Dr. Gupta is pointing out. You have to also reposition your ideas. Because I think that will be very critical to the kind of distinction you make. We have driven in the past from, in the earlier times after independence, India positioned itself with what we call as the power of the idea. Post 90s, we have taken the shift to talk about the idea of power. And probably in the 21st century, we have to talk about how does both come together. You cannot have one without the other. Right?
Good.
Just power without an ideational base will also not take you very far. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Sidhu, you have said many things, but still one more minute if you want.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bas.
And I'll confine myself to three very, very briefly. The first is we really need to bridge the gap between, the global philosophical dimension and the practicality of it. Dr. Gupta's idea of the Vasudev Kutumbakam as a sort of informing principle is fantastic, but I think we really need to talk it through. And some of the issues which have been raised, I think are worth thinking. How would that be implemented in reality? Yeah. If somebody is challenging the tolerance, who is going to enforce that? Are we going to follow in some ways, if you like the Mahabharata analogy, and actually have a civil war between the family, which destroys the family in some ways? Or are we actually looking to create something entirely new? For example, Dr. Baru talked about earlier references to Vasudev Kutumbakam, but I think the original one in many ways was Nehru, when he talked about the idea of the one world approach, the sense of empowering the multilateral institution in a way to play that role of maintaining the world as a family. So I think it would be fantastic if the Vivekananda Institute actually did a seminar or a conference just on this issue, but really seeing how is it likely to be implemented? What are the kind of mechanisms that we need to do and engage as well? Second, I think India, if it's serious about multilateralism and it's proud of the fact that it is now the 5th largest economy before COVID, of course that may change a little after COVID, it needs to then reflect that in its contributions to the UN and other multilateral agencies. India is nowhere close to any one of the major, donors or supporters of that. And this is where, China is running rings around it, because now it's also coming into an area which India is justifiably proud of, which was its peacekeeping. It's matching both of that. Last but not the least, India really needs to have a multi-stakeholder approach starting at home. Ambassador Puri asked the question, and I'll pick up on that, simply to say, let's start with bridging the divide between North and South Bloc. I think that's a very important element. Where are your institutions dedicated to multilateralism? There are different parts happening in different institutions. RIS is doing development. Others are looking at, area studies. Others looking at non-proliferation. We need to bring all of this together under one roof. Otherwise, it's simply not going to happen. And I want to credit Ambassador Puri for these two suggestions, and I'll end there with your permission, Professor Harshe. If India is going to get 2 terms of the presidency of the UN Security Council over the next 2 years, I would very strongly recommend that one of them should be at the prime ministerial level and the other at the foreign minister level, at the very least. But it has to be something extremely concrete, extremely specific, extremely operational and functional. The Security Council is not a place to philosophize. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we all agree that this was a very interesting panel, very fluently given ideas, and we are carrying a lot from what happened. I would just give some of my own reflections. I think what Dr. Arvind was saying has a point, because no country can have a foreign policy without a vision. And if we are in search of a vision, what could be that vision for the 21st century and ahead? So somewhere he was throwing ideas one after another, and those ideas are also important, but they have to be concretized, they have to be tested against concrete empirical realities, tested against concrete evidences, and that is where what I thought was Dr. Baru, what he was saying, becomes important. That there is something like hard power, like there is something like industrial and military preparedness, nuclear preparedness, security complexes. There is something like knowledge producing apparatuses which are strong. There is something like constant push to technology. There is something like effort to build AI or even information technology on a scale which is very different. Otherwise, in this particular world, India will not be able to survive. And what is that effort that India needs to make? Because he was constantly making a point about how will we accommodate China and America both. Or somewhere this is a very difficult task after Cold War. At one stage, Nehru found a bridge in non-alignment to accommodate Russia and China, talked about meeting ground of East and the West, synthesizing East and the West. What are we now thinking again new, which will make us deal with both the powers? China is so powerful that it is important trading partners. We can't wish away China. United States is also so powerful that it is a member of Quad, where we are working in Indo-Pacific together with Australia, Japan and United States. How many ways we'll balance it out, and how many ways we'll see that we are only looking after foreign policy with reference to India's interest, and we are not siding with either America or China, and we are ready to accommodate both and coexist with both. And that is the challenge before India. Once again, it is again post-Cold War challenge, and new power is emerging. But it doesn't mean Russia is not there. I think China is there in Eurasia, and India is also trying to play its role in Eurasia. But China is also there in RCEP, and India, has it lost or missed opportunity by not joining it, or we need to join it, or leave the entire market of Southeast Asian countries to China itself? That also is a question needs to be debated. I also feel that, Dr. Bava raised, she took a complex position where, you are leading and yet be partner. Now, it's a very difficult thing to do, because I can tell you from personal experience, it sounds very beautiful. Actually, I taught in South Asian University for 5 years. And the manner in which neighboring countries were critical of India on many scores, I had to hear it in the classroom where I are teaching international relations. And it becomes difficult to be both a partner and a leader. I think somewhere you have to countries which are weaker than India have to make them understand that it is not exploitative relationship. India is interested in capacity building. India is interested in seeing that real development takes place. And India is also interested in working out growth and development match. If growth is quantitative, development can be quantitative. India is interested in both with the weaker partners. But with the stronger partners, leadership role goes. Sometimes how do you deal with that? And there was also a point which came up in Sanjay, it was made perhaps, that the middle-ranging powers, how they can cooperate with India. Actually, we have transcontinental organization like BRICS, but how many ways it can possibly cooperate? If Brazil, India, South Africa, they didn't show much of cooperation. It's a talk. And talk on general matters like environment, climate, cyber technology, terrorism. Actual cooperation between Brazil and India, how can it take place? India and Latin America have never cooperated at all anywhere. So these are very concrete problems. Actually, what India is doing is in a large number of countries in Africa, India is surging ahead, and I can give you plenty of examples of how it is surging. And there can be multilateralism. India is also involved in regional organizations in Africa like SADC or ECOWAS. It is also involved with African Union. So, it depends on how you understand the reality given at hand. I was also particularly concerned and also interested in the manner in which Dr. Sidhu was raising questions. To me, they were politically exciting questions, because I can tell you certain disorderly things which he talked. That was politically exciting for me. There is something like, terror, for instance. We don't try to define it. We never arrive at a definition which is comprehensive or mutually acceptable. And yet, this particular phenomenon has been existing. Like you had a multinational terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda, because Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan. People began to think that it would pass away, wither away, but it has not happened. It has its branches in Al-Shabaab in East Africa, Boko Haram in West Africa. You have also Jaish and Lashkar-e-Taiba with Al-Qaeda. So, amount of disorder, any multinational terrorist organization is a multinational company. And we have to think of it. And at one stage, for instance, we are also thinking that, look, we are a multinational terrorist organization, but they have no state of their own. But they established Islamic State for some time, and they gathered revenues to fight and create problems. So we have to kind of look at multilateralism also with, even if we think of middle powers, their respective ambitions. Like, Russia has ambitions in Syria, also trying to build base. Russia is, to get in Libya. So all middle-ranging powers somewhere are trying to build their power within world politics, and that's how your multilateralism will be influenced, shaped, and we have to think of all these problems which Dr. Sidhu raised, which are disturbing problems. 1 second, it's not coming through. Yeah, that's right. So I think with these few words, I thought I should thank all the speakers for giving absolutely first-rate kind of presentations. And it was so enjoyable to listen to all that I learned a great deal. I'm sure audiences have also enjoyed it immensely. I thank the organizers and the speakers. And I think let me kind of hand over to now Deepika for the next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Rajen Harshe, for concluding this session almost on time. Now we will directly move on to our roundtable session on agenda for India's UNSC tenure 21-22. May I now invite Dr. Arvind Gupta to chair the session. We have as three speakers, Professor Bimal Patel, Vice Chancellor Raksha Shakti University, Gujarat. We have Professor Priyankar Upadhyay, UNESCO Chair for Peace and Intercultural Understanding, Banaras Hindu University, and we have Dr. Manpreet Sethi, Distinguished Fellow, Center for Air Power Studies. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Deepika, and good evening to everyone. I think we had some fantastic sessions earlier in the day, and this is a fitting end, this roundtable, to now really come to that very important point. Now India is joining is coming to the UN Security Council for the 8th time. But I think this time it is very different because the world has changed in so many ways, and the As we have heard, that multilateralism is in deep crisis, and new ideas are needed, and a lot of suggestions have been made. So I think that's one backdrop of India joining the UN Security Council. And then you have the deepening geopolitical tensions. We heard about US and China and how the two are now, I think there's so much of gap between the two, and whether that chasm can be bridged, and what impact it will have on the rest of the world. And India will be affected quite deeply by the growing tensions between the two, or even if they accommodate with each other, even then we have, I think, some problems coming our way. Then there is a big problem of climate change. This has been described as existential threat, and the carbon space is also limited, and this is also affecting multilateralism in a big way, and India will also be impacted. And of course, then we have, since Manpreet is here, that also brings me to the very serious WMD issues, which have not gone away. In fact, they have become worse as our disarmament is in shambles. The NPT is under crisis, and now we have cyber and space threats emerging, and a whole lot of issues in the global commons. So this is the backdrop that we are now faced with. These are the challenges, and India is joining. So it's going to be two very eventful years. So the question that I have is, firstly, what difference can India make? As we were discussing in the morning, UN Security Council is a very formal organization. It has its own work procedures and rules. So a non-permanent member, what difference can it really make? What kind of issues can it bring to the table? And I think Ambassador Manjipuri also said in the morning that perhaps we should be careful and not try to bring too many issues, because that could open the Pandora's box, and it could diffuse the focus. And so what is it that we should do? So to discuss these important, this seminar can bring a kind of some suggestions for the policymakers. And one or two good suggestions have already been made in just a little while ago, that India will have the chairmanship twice perhaps, and these meetings should be held either at the Prime Minister level, or convened at the Prime Minister level, or at the External Affairs Minister level. So that's one practical suggestion. But now I hand over to the panelists to deliberate over this and give us their views. We are very short of time, so I think if we have to have some discussion, maybe 5 to 7 minutes is about the maximum for your opening remarks, and then we can have some discussions. Because at 7 o'clock, two of us have to go and attend another webinar. So that is basically the reason. So now let us start with Professor Patel, who has already been introduced, but I also may add that he is a legal expert, and he is also a member of the NSAB, and he has made a lot of contribution in the international law area, and he has made a lot of suggestions as a member of the NSAB as to how India should be dealing with, from the legal point of view, some of these issues. So Professor Patel, floor is yours, and you kindly take about 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta, Mr. Raghavan and ICWA for this opportunity. India, together with Kenya, Ireland, Norway, Mexico, Vietnam, Tunisia, Saint Vincent and Grenadine, Nigeria and Estonia, will constitute E10, that is elected 10, in 2021, and 5 new members in 22. For how long will India be kept out of the decision-making structures of the United Nations? Is a profound decisive question that will determine our ongoing engagement with the UN, as put by the Prime Minister Modi during his 26 September address at the UN General Assembly. India's tenure as an elected member actually will enable us all to assess India's weight, influence and power in a total of 44 agenda items, 35 country-specific and 9 thematic items, 5 from Europe, 10 belonging to Asia, 17 Africa, and 3 Latin America specific. A taste, in my view, for India's foreign policy indeed. The Council will be able to take decisions on any of these items if at least 9 members vote in favor, with none of the permanent members using a veto. Contribution of India together with other elected 9 members may go down in history either as a lame duck or key player, as Leiden University seminar sometime back shows. We have to wait and watch. I would have liked to quickly mention 2 to 3 lines major issues of each of the 44 items, which could give us political, legal, economic, strategic governance appreciation and forecasting of possible Indian position, but the time is definitely a constraint. The records and the history of the Council evidence the fact that nothing gets done without the E10. So I would use when E means elected 10. The role of E10 will be limited, but certainly meaningful. India will be able to advance its own initiatives on several country-specific and thematic agenda items, including piracy, terrorism, sanctions, civilian in armed conflicts, piracy, and working methods. When India will be having less than direct interest, it will be able to provide help or forge a coalition of interest with other E9 who have direct interests. There are several country-specific peace processes where India has an opportunity for collective leadership through partnership of the Council with due emphasis on multilateralism and international norms. India will be able to calibrate its policies and improve its positions on 44 country and thematic issues, and not just in 21-22, but beyond 23. This is huge for deepening our understanding and ties with the countries concerned and on the themes. Beyond 23, India will be able to augment some of the initiatives which it would take during the tenure in other forums. Very interestingly, my research assessment of priorities of elected 9 enabled me to reasonably state that there will be significant convergence of interests of India vis-a-vis other elected 9, which is reassuring when I say India will be able to influence the outcome on these 44 items. One area where India can play a more meaningful role is ongoing review of the working methods, which need to be guided by E10 interest in procedural guarantees and practical arrangements to ensure more democratic inclusiveness and transparency. I will come back to this later. It will be interesting to see how India will identify and explore its joint strengths with other E9. Similarly, which tools India and other E9 will individually and collectively employ, such as creation of subsidiary organs, presidential statements, informal working groups, concept notes, and non-papers. India will certainly find out niche on the Council on the existing and those items that will be freshly introduced in the Council. India, like other E9, face the challenges of 2-year term, the chairing of the sanction committees and other subsidiary bodies, the increased weight of the necessary Council business and working methods of the Council, including the controversial and frustrating Pant holder system. But let me reaffirm what Peter Wilson, the former UK Deputy PR, had to say. The system of Pant holder is a source of significant frustration for E10 as simply tradition. If elected members wish to take the pen, there is nothing formally stopping them from doing so. He also had to say, and I believe in that, it is absolutely possible to achieve things during one's term as an elected member, and in order to do so, India has to stand for things and to strongly negotiate as a country, and I add, not as a group.
Okay.
India has an important tenure to play the leading role in promoting the international rule of law within the Council, at times in difference to the permanent members in areas such as terrorism and sanctions. The sanctions regime has come a long way, and as the Office of the Ombudsman experience shows, India can further the cause of fairness and transparency in operations of UN sanctions regime. This is an area where I personally
if you could
expect,
conclude this. Yeah.
sure, tangible contribution of India. Let me have very few practical notes will be required to ensure consistency between our previous terms and this term. Second, number of issues will have implications for discussions and decisions in other forms, such as South China related discussions may come up in the IMO, FAO, UNESCO, but it will also have implications in UNSC. Compliance reports submitted by UN member states concerned under terrorism and sanctions. Related resolution is another area for identifying and highlighting how countries are complying with those resolutions and how India can add into the quality debates of the compliance. My analysis of political economy of voting in the UN Security Council shows that E10 will gain and get more favorable treatment from P5 in form of loans, waivers, conditionalities from various financial institutions. China in the post-COVID-19 situation is likely to rely upon this proven strategy of the P5, Germany, Japan and Republic of Korea to procure its credibility and image in the international system, especially with regard to elected developing members. There are also issues with regard to the working methods, but as you say, because of the time constraint, I'm not able to deliberate on that. Finally, what I would say is conventional wisdom has it that the successful functioning of the UN Security Council depends on the role played by P5 and the extent to which they can agree or avoid to fundamentally disagree on the main issues. But the Council consists of 10 elected members who represent 5 different regions, and India's 2 years tenure, its initiatives, strategies, showing leadership, finding consensus when things will fall apart, and tangible contribution on 44 items will have cumulative effect on translating the legitimate claim to a reality for permanent membership. Thus, in my view, a very interesting inning ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think in your short opening remarks, you have covered a lot and focused on E10 and how India can work with them. We'll come to these points later. And now I request Professor Priyankar Upadhyay to kindly make his remarks.
Thank you so much, Arvind, for this opportunity, although it's a very small window, 5-7 minutes. But anyway, it's good also because a lot of grounds are already covered by my preceding speaker about the E10 and what India actually could do in practical terms. I would remain confined to some of the overarching observations about what might happen and how we should look at India's 8th-time entry into the Security Council. Now, there are two ways I suppose we can look at India's interest or India's perspective. One is how India could use its membership to safeguard its interest, and the second is, of course, how India is able to promote the UN agenda on multilateralism and the quest of global commons embedded in SDGs and so on and so forth, the idealist notion which actually brings all these countries together and not the specific power politics things that is in my mind. Now, at the outset, my sense is that perhaps the present scenario does not provide a lot of expectations, and we shouldn't expect radical transference in India's overall approach, and rather a continuation, which Professor Patil also suggested earlier, to the change and continuity as we call it. And this is precisely because of the current disposition of Security Council and United Nations in general. There is not much that we should hope would be possible. Of course, India will try and make its point of view, and especially in view of its continuing efforts to paddle for the reformed multilateralism and also perhaps to deepen its international imprint. Now, that brings me to the whole question of reform multilateralism, and I think we haven't really discussed so far, and the facts are very well known, so I would not stay there for long. But as our Prime Minister also said, that this reform multilateralism is in responses, in the process, and in the very character of the United Nations is the need of the hour. Now, how could India use that 2 years' time to bring about changes? And I think on this point, its self-interest or its personal interest to find a legitimate role in Security Council, and also the long-standing, long-drawn quest to expand the Security Council to make it more representative, they converge. But once again, the challenge is, and it's very well known, how China and some other countries, the stout opposition of 30 middle powers, etc., would not allow this to happen. Now, what could India do during this role is to actually bring up this issue. It's always a question of raising these issues in the platform, and India has been doing it in United Nations General Assembly. But probably it's a very important pointer, and people who watch United Nations and who work on it realize that unless the Security Council is reformed and unless there is a realistic representation of the countries, there will be no expectation. But having said this, my own sense is that we should not worry too much on this point. This is an ongoing quest, and India can keep on hoping to find its rightful position. But also we need to be realistically prepared to settle for a compromise. Maybe it's a tentative compromise, perhaps a new category of members elected for a longer duration than the present non-permanent members without veto power. This is one of the things that has been happening. So this is one thing. And also the fact that India could perhaps push forward some of its initiatives in recent past, first relating to the draft comprehensive convention on international terrorism, which India drafted and revised with the hope of helping consensus, but it encountered reservations from among many countries on provisions regarding the definition of terrorist. And I think on this issue, India would keep on peddling, and perhaps with the new Biden administration coming in, India would have a legitimate partner to work with. So now India's future role perhaps will depend on its ability to cope with the impact of multiple crises it now faces on account of global economic slowdown and its troubled relationship with China. We all know China won't let anything happen given the kind of salience and predominance it has. Now, one thing that is very clear is, and that's been India's traditional strength, that it has been doing its best, and that's what the role it should really carry out in upholding the Charter principles and mounting effective punitive measures against those who support, finance, and sponsor terrorism, for example. And besides, there is another aspect that India has been pushing for, and it is striving to secure due say to the true contributing countries in the management of peace operations. There are a lot of such issues, I'm skipping them. And I think the very fact is that the UN needs a lot of support and a lot of endorsement because of the tremendous, unprecedented decline in multilateralism. I think this point has come up again and again in preceding sessions. But I would say that India, with its commitment to international morality, democratization of international relations, should do its best. And one of the ways is that as the world enters the decade of action to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, I think India could take it more earnestly in its policies and also within the Security Council. And also probably this is a point which I, as a peace researcher, I feel very strongly that the Secretary General's recent proposal about sustaining peace, which is, I think, a newer form, a more holistic concept of peace building not in the post-conflict sense, but also in terms of preventing diplomacy. Now, this is an aspect that comes close to our own understanding. So this idea can be raised and can be nurtured, and especially in the emphasis that Indian leadership and our Prime Minister has often talked about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, looking at the world as a larger family. I think India could really lap up this concept of sustaining peace, preventive diplomacy, and perhaps raise these issues in Security Council. I think this is a new concept which has captured the attention of international community. Having said all this, I think India has already won the moral and functional requirements for a permanent seat at the UN Security Council, and we can very well wait, but then at the same time we should be able to work with, as we say, as a soft power. So there are a lot of ideas, but I think I would stop here, Arvind, as you warned us, and wait for the discussions to have. Thank you.
It was a very rich presentation. I mean, what you said is, despite constraints, I think there's still many areas that India can work on. And it's not just to safeguard your own interests, but there's whole lot of issues to promote UN agenda, etc. And I think terrorism and SDG goals are certainly and UN peacekeeping. I think these are the areas that we can work. But again, the question is whether the procedures and the rules, etc., would allow that those issues to come up. So there are many issues of that nature. So now I turn to Dr. Manpreet Sethi, whom you know very well. And Manpreet, 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, sir. And my gratitude also to Dr. Raghavan for this opportunity to participate in not only a well-conceived, but also a very well-timed conference. As the last speaker in the last session, I think I better be brief. So let me jump to the 3 issues that I want to flag in the context of India's tenure. I want to spend just about a minute on the political environment because we've heard enough about it in the last session. A minute on the kind of role this calls for on the part of India. And then most part of my remarks are on the focus areas that could be part of India's agenda. And you're right, sir, the working processes will not allow all of them to come on, but these are more like giving ideas to our, policymakers to see what can fit into which part of the multilateral system that we are talking about and how it could be reflected in the UN Security Council. So firstly, on the political environment in which India joins the forum, we all know that it is fraught with interstate tensions, trust levels are low, nationalistic hedging is high, and the so-called common goods or international security seems to be out of focus. We've also heard that multilateral institutions stand dented over the last few years, and especially by the pandemic. So India's tenure is coming at a rather challenging time. But I think this also gives us an opportunity through our actions and interventions to change some of the trend lines that, all of us have been flagging through the day. So what should be India's role at a time like this? To my mind, it should be to recall into attention the relevance and benefits of global cooperative security over individualistic, atomistic approaches that we have seen in the last decade or so. The speaker just before me, Professor Upadhyay, was talking about this approach or that. I think they don't have to be mutually exclusive. So my self-interest also comes from the global conditions which are existing, and therefore they have to be done in tandem. By bringing the threats that we are facing today are more and more of global reach and character, and no nation can hope to fence itself off and be safe. So therefore, joint efforts at cooperative security are needed. And India, I think, is singularly well placed to bring this into active consciousness since, Dr. Gupta, as you mentioned earlier, the concept of oneness of life is part of our culture. And as part of our strategic culture, India prioritizes peace over security. So given our past record of participation in the UNSC, we have been seen as bridge builders across concepts. And this role, I think, will come into sharper relief given the kind of depolarization among the P5 that we see. The MEA spokesperson, I think, in one of, press releases had mentioned India will work with maturity and moderation. And I think this does sum up how India would be acting. Now, it is a given that nations engage with outside world in ways that best further their national interest. Dr. Sanjaya Babu brought that out very clearly about hard power and self-interest and realism. And realpolitik is anyway the modern day mantra. But in making this a virtue, India's recognition of the importance of a principled or a values-based approach on peace and security should not be summarily dismissed. I think we've built a certain amount of soft power and, a perception on this, which should not be given up very easily just because we've become more hard-nosed with our realpolitik approach now. So now I want to just identify focus areas for the agenda. Before doing that, there are 3 principles on which I put these areas. For ease of recall, I give them the acronym of WIN, W-I-N, working to ensure fairness and equity in multilateralism, inculcating respect for rule of law, and nurturing peace and security. These are the 3 principles essentially on which the UN was founded. But somewhere along the lines, some of them have faded out of our consciousness, and I feel India's intervention could bring them back into sharper focus. So under these principles now, I want to situate some of the issues. My first principle was working to ensure a fair and equitable multilateral system. India's efforts in this context may be needed in the next year to counter what is beginning to be called as vaccine nationalism. Professor Bava mentioned this. While COVID-19 has hardly left any nation unaffected, it is feared that vaccine availability will be skewed in favor of richer and more powerful nations. But fair distribution and equitable access to the vaccine is nothing short of a global public good, given that the pandemic has shown how beholden our health is to the health of the others. And India should throw its weight behind ensuring just and unbiased access to the vaccine for nations. So this is one issue, example of an issue that can fall under my W. On the second principle of inculcating respect for rule of law, I would suggest two issues. One, non-traditional threats to maritime security, such as marine pollution or to fragile marine ecosystems due to non-adherence to laws that already exist. The second issue pertains to security of outer space. Now, I realize that law in this domain is iffy, but a focus on non-traditional security threats, such as growing debris in space or traffic management, could benefit all stakeholders, and they hold a common appeal, and this is where we could work. On the third principle of nurturing peace and security, India could focus on three issues of global and national significance. The first of these is obviously transnational terrorism, and this has been mentioned by both my previous panelists. It's an unfortunate fact that terror networks are better connected today than nations seem to be, and acts of terrorism have reached new frontiers and new unthinkable levels of brutality. No country, therefore, can afford an ostrich-like approach and, hide under the shadow of definitions and things like that. So India needs to draw attention to this issue and search for solutions. Striking at the terror finance infrastructure, use of information and communication technologies by terrorists, these are all areas that need to be brought in. The second focus point in my mind could be bio-warfare. BTWC does exist, but it is toothless, and many handicaps it has, as we have seen in the case of the raging pandemic. So this issue needs more rethinking and action. My third issue is that of growing nuclear risks, given my love for nuclear issues, and especially due to inadvertent escalation. More than the risk of a deliberate, premeditated nuclear attack, it is the risk of stumbling into a nuclear war due to misperceptions created by doctrines, technologies that introduce time pressures or automation. These are far more tangible threats today, and I think India faces these from both its nuclear neighbors. And they are not amenable to bilateral or regional solutions. So we have to search for it at the global level. Perhaps the idea of a fourth special session on disarmament is something that India should put its weight behind. Let me conclude, sir, by saying that COVID-19 has brought us face to face with mutual vulnerability like never before. Everyone has spoken about retraction of economies, of all the other deglobalization, the trends moving in that direction. But mutual vulnerability, I think we all understand like never before as a result of the pandemic. More than ever, we need to recognize that a self-centered approach, whether at the individual or the national level, is unlikely to provide us with dividends that will last over a period of time. You might get some short-term benefits, but for the long run, the view has to be different. And I think this is India's opportunity during its tenure at the UNSC to foster this attitude. You might not get the results we are looking for on each subject or on each country case, but can we foster this spirit, this attitude through the subject's nature and tenor of our engagement? Thank you so much for the opportunity, sir.
Thank you, Manpreet. Again, a very rich discussion, remarks, and a whole lot of issues. But I liked your bridge building role, I think. That is something that ties in nicely with the Vasudev Kutumbakam and other ideas, soft power, etc., that we talked about. And I think both you and Professor Upadhyay also mentioned. You mentioned about not taking a self-centered approach, taking a more like a global approach. And I think COVID is just the right moment for us to really push for a more holistic approach and a more tolerant approach, and where we should also speak openly and strongly in favor of the SDG and that kind of agenda. But I think all the three presenters made one point that India can play a role. There's a whole lot of issues that we can weigh in, and we should really be well prepared. And I think I like that idea of looking beyond, which is Professor Patel's idea of looking beyond the 2 years. Because this is a learning time for you, because you are now going into UN Security Council when a new world is shaping up. So it's for you to build engagements, friendships, alliances, coalitions, and work on these initiatives maybe even after 2 years, and also improve your understanding. I think this is something very powerful. But of course, the government will take its view as to what the procedures allow and what can be realistically done. But as we can see today, UN Security Council is also has many other ways of dealing with these issues. For instance, I think it was in 2019 that they had more than 200 interactions with the experts. So they are also reaching out to the experts. So India can probably take some initiative in that direction, and some of these ideas which cannot otherwise be brought formally on the table, but maybe India can play a role along with the E10 that Professor Patel talked about, and arrange for these discussions so that there is a greater visibility and awareness about these issues. So thank you very much. Now we have 10 minutes. And the floor is open. Anybody would like to make a comment? And I can see, can somebody help me with the chat box, Deepika? Is there any question? I've not really seen. Just one moment. I think Umaji is saying the aim should be to have a UNSC resolution passed. What is it on? Can you just come out, Professor Uma? Can you say, can you explain what? Yeah. Please.
Yes, thank you. Just a conversation with WBS that we should use the 2 years to co-brand India at the UN. I think that's extremely important. Right. An initiative where the Prime Minister, maybe the EAM also engage with it. I think we shy away from that, and if what the speakers have also said, this is a moment to seize, I think. Yeah, so that's what we were saying, that how would we convert it? How can India pick up one agenda item among the list which is there and present and bring a resolution? I think that would be something very significant.
Is Ambassador Manjipuri there? Since he has worked with the UNSC so closely, maybe he would like to make an intervention at this stage?
No, sir, he is not here.
Okay, right. He is not there. Any other comment from anyone?
Yeah, so Sidhu's, I think, asking a question.
Sidhu, Professor Sidhu, yes?
He's put in the chat box if I should read it.
He seems to agree with you. Question to the panelists.
No, he started it off and I was following up with him.
Okay.
The
if there was one issue on which India wanted a UNSC resolution, what would it be? Okay, that's a good question.
I think we both agree that there should be a strong India-based move at this point.
Okay, so the panelists, Dr. Patel, would you like to come in?
Sure. I would say that maritime security is an area where the entire global community will find a consensus, and especially with regard to the non-military maritime security threats on which there is a huge amount of convergence across the nations. So I think maritime is an area where we should definitely have one unanimous resolution.
Okay. Maybe you may take some other comment also. Maybe Upadhyay sir, Professor Upadhyay, would you like to comment on this? This is a very interesting question.
It's very difficult to decide. But my sense is that given India's practical needs and also given its traditional, very strong normative base in terms of peace ideas and peace building, notwithstanding the current turmoils and so on and so forth around its neighborhood, I think India should reinforce very strongly the recent idea of sustaining peace, and especially the preventive diplomacy, arguing out that we need to bring peace at the civil society level, at our community level, and the local approaches, the local turn in peace building. And I think that is an argument that's taking round in UN corridors, and this indigenous and local approaches to peace building, going from community level up there. I think India could really put its lot. I mean, the challenge, as everybody said, is that who's the buyer? I mean, Security Council, as it is not in a great shape, and who will buy these arguments? But this is what India should and must contribute.
Okay. Dr. Manpreet Sethi?
Well, it's a great question, sir, and difficult to answer. You can expect Professor Sidhu to always ask the most difficult questions. I would support both the ideas which the panelists have suggested, but also put in a word for terrorism, as well as a resolution of the kind, which reflects that a nuclear war cannot be won and therefore should not be fought. Something like that, which I think should be acceptable to everyone. Unfortunately, there is a leadership vacuum on many of the nuclear issues. But if we can get some of the like-minded nations with us on this, and there are several who are keen to have that reiterated, what was once said by Gorbachev and Reagan, but which resonates across 9 nuclear armed states today, as well as non-nuclear weapon states. Given that the non-nuclear weapon states don't want to be party to the ban treaty, this could be one way of bridge building between the nuclear and the non-nuclear weapon states, and could be an idea that could be taken up for a resolution at the UNSC level.
Okay. I'm sure Professor Sidhu has something up his sleeve. That's why he's asking this question. So why don't you give the answer to the question you asked?
I honestly don't, but I'm just looking a little bit at history and see how other very high-level, presidencies of the council have worked. And the one example that comes to mind is that of President Obama in 2009, where he took a very radical step, and the UN Security Council passed unanimously Resolution 1887, which is on non-proliferation, etc., but it really gave a lot of emphasis on something that he was interested in, but also made them look in a very good light. So I think what you're hearing here is a fantastic set of suggestions, but I think one of the challenges will be to narrow it down to one practical, very operational, functional kind of issue. What is it we want the resolution to say and do, and how do we want it to empower India's role within the UN, within the region, and in other ways? And I think this is a terrific opportunity. I think Professor Patel's idea of something related to maritime, Dr. Sethi's idea also in the non-proliferation realm, in the idea of trying to, building the bridge, I think are all terrific. But again, work would need to begin now so that you can try to make sure that you have a unanimous resolution again. And here, the African members, all the other elected members are going to be absolutely crucial as well. So just by way of that, I think this would be a great opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have come to the close of this roundtable. And I want to thank the panelists and the organizers for giving us this opportunity. I want to just make a couple of short observations and then we'll close. This Manpreet's idea about SSOD, another SSOD, I think that makes sense because this will this time bring in some other challenges which are already facing us. So if India can agitate for this amongst the UN members and using its presence in the UNSC, I think that will be a great idea. I also feel that the maritime security, some kind of that is also workable, and probably many countries would also join in. But I want to just leave one or two more thoughts. That's not so much to do with the UNSC, but perhaps the UN General Assembly as some kind of a resolution. Just as you had International Yoga Day, and that has given India so much of visibility and also popularized yoga, etc. So some of these soft power ideas that we talked about, whether these could be brought in the UNGA where people could join hands. And here, what I have in mind is, this very important question of harmony in diversity, which is something which appeals to everyone. And actually, I want to thank Professor Upadhyay. In one of our earlier seminars, he had drawn my attention to Ubuntu, the idea of Ubuntu, which is coming from Africa, which is very much like our Vasudev Kutumbakam, world is a family, something like that. So if we could bring a resolution in the UNGA, and maybe Vivekananda's birthday, because Vivekananda is a very powerful concept. As a person who talked at 1893 as a globalist and yet very firmly rooted in Indian civilization and talked about the inclusiveness of the Indian civilization, etc. So whether Vivekananda's birthday could be declared as a day of harmony, etc. So one very specific thing, and that can go through the UNGA. Whether India could use this opportunity to make that pitch for his birthday being declared as the day of harmony, universal harmony or something like that. But in the UNSC, I do not know whether UNSC has ever discussed the security threats coming out of inequality and poverty. तो WPS सिद्धू जी, ये एक आइडिया है आपके लिए, आप भी थोड़ा लिखिए इसके ऊपर, that how security is, and this used to be talked about earlier, but we have forgotten that poverty is also a security issue. So securitization is happening of every issue, but poverty, linking it up with the SDG, etc., and getting the people committed to dealing with poverty and removing their insecurity in the minds of people, I think that's an idea that we should probably work on. And maybe in the UN Security Council, that is something that can be worked. So, yes, you want to say something?
Very briefly, just to endorse that, that's an excellent idea. And certainly with the Biden-Harris administration, who are more willing to acknowledge and accept that poverty is not just in the global south, but everywhere.
Now it's
and
everywhere.
The fact that there's actually a special rapporteur's report on poverty in the United Kingdom and the United States, I think working, and you have a very good ambassador designate coming in for with lots of experience in Africa. I think that could work, but the question is, would India be comfortable enough in having that as a topic? If India is, by all means, I think that's really good, because it will also expand that India is also looking at the Security Council to look at non-traditional security dimensions like poverty, for example. So I think there's a lot of potential there.
That would tie in very well with the SDG. When you think the countdown to the 2030 starts, if you identify just poverty, it also sometimes makes it that the attention draws to us. But for the hesitation of the UNSC on, even taking up the pandemic also shows the hesitation about traditional and non-traditional, which you brought out. But I think it's a good moment for brand India to be visible, I think, Sidhu. I think that's what is so important. It can't be business as usual.
And also link... Sorry.
Yeah. If you link it up to SDG, I think that would offer a real big platform on which to stand, because all of it is interconnected,
And also it will tie up nicely with the vaccine nationalism, which Mantri talked about.
Yeah. And in fact, I don't think there is a resolution, Security Council resolution on the SDGs. No. I think it'd be worth looking at, and that may be something to absolutely... there's lots of very good ideas, but again, sorry.
So since all of you academics do deep research, I think dig out something and some arguments, etc. And we shouldn't stop here. Perhaps make out even a short letter to the Prime Minister or to the External Affairs Minister, putting 3 or 4 of these things. We would be happy to send it to them and probably...
I think we should tell Ambassador Raghavan that as an outcome of this, one-day webinar, there may be key ideas, and just send it across. I think a start has to be made, because 2 years is too short. It takes time to put these things and move it,
Okay.
to get the political apparatus to buy into that and then say, okay, let's prepare to get it done. Because then the real work is on the other side, convincing others to come on board. But I think this is a moment which should really not be missed.
Just a quick remark. Just a quick remark, if you can hear me.
Yeah.
It's that this is very much on the radar of the Secretary General. I mean, we talked about Security Council not being so cognizant, not being so sensitive. But if you look at the framing of this sustaining peace, which is a most favorite concept of the Secretary General, this came out of a joint resolution of General Assembly and the Security Council, and which links peace directly to SDG. I mean, the argument that without SDG, no peace, and peace is a part of that. So I think this is very much there, and perhaps we can bring in some of the indigenous ideas, as Dr. Arvind was mentioning, about the normative things, because the time has come to talk about alternative approaches and scenarios. So it can all work very well. That's what my point is. There'll be nothing new in this. It's very much happening there.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great. So thank you very much. We now close our session, and Deepika, I hope you are recording this. And some of these ideas probably you can, in your summary, perhaps you can submit it to the Director General for his information and whatever action he wishes to take. So thank you very much, and good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair and speakers. With this, we come to the end of our webinar. I take this opportunity to thank all our chairs, panelists, participants for their time and attention. I would like to express my thanks to Dr. T.C. Raghavan, DG ICWA, and Mr. Sumen Bakshi, DDG ICWA, for their guidance, and special thanks to Madam Nutan Kapoor Mahwar, JS ICWA, for her valuable support and supervision during the process of organizing this conference. Last but not the least, I take the opportunity to thank Dr. Nivedita Ray, Director Research ICWA, and our research and technical team for their support. Thank you, and we look forward to you joining us for